Hi, and welcome to this short video on how to correct what is known as anterior pelvic tilt. So most people who spend their day sitting down a lot at a desk or driving around will end up with very tight hip flexors. There's two types of hip flexors. You've got the psoas muscles, which cross over the hip joint, and you've got one of the quad muscles called the rectus femoris that attaches from your hip down to the knee. So it has two jobs. The one we're looking at is its job of hinging at the hip or flexing the hip. And that's what most people find becomes tight, the psoas muscles and the rec fem, and that causes our pelvis to tilt forward like a bucket of water. So if you think of a bucket of water, the water's coming out the top and front of the bucket, and that's caused by tightness through the hip flexors, but also weakness in the lower abdominals. If the hip flexors are flexible and the lower abdominals are strong, then it pulls the pelvis back underneath the spine, so the bucket now is level. That also requires our glutes to actually activate and our hamstrings to pull the pelvis down at the back. So, which is very rare, but if people have what we call a posterior tilt, then they've got too strong and too tight glutes and too strong and tight hamstrings. That is very rare. The majority of people have an anterior tilt. That does cause your hamstrings to tighten up because they're having to work on trying to stop your pelvis from tilting even further forward. So they're working all the time to try to prevent it. Where if we get the lower abdominals working harder and the hip flexors switch off, then our pelvis sits what we call neutral, and then the hamstrings can relax. So I'm just going to show you a couple of things you can do really quickly and easily, but it has to be done on a daily basis for it to be effective. The first is to release the hip flexors and then to strengthen up the glutes. And that's important, that to really strengthen up your glutes, you've got to release the hip flexors. Muscles work against each other. When one muscle fires and engages, as in the hip flexors, this one has to switch off. This one switches on, this one switches off. Switch on, switch off, switch on, switch off. So we need to make sure if you've got your hip flexors always switched on from a lot of sitting, then we've got to switch them off first before we can really work on getting the glutes stronger. So a couple of ways you can do a hip flexor stretch is, most people know this one, down on one knee. And this back leg is what we're trying to stretch. But because we're trying to stretch the upper hip flexors, as I was saying, the psoas muscles, we've got to get it so our pelvis is tilted back. So not the anterior tilt that we're trying to correct, we're going to tilt the pelvis back, and that will make you engage your glutes, and you'll feel a stretch at the top of the quads here, top of the leg. If you kind of lean forward, you're not really going to feel it. You might feel it down close to the knee, but if we want the top hip flexors to stretch, we need to tilt that pelvis. Okay. To increase it, you can put the same arm on the side you're stretching up, and that can get a big long stretch down into the hip flexor. It's not 100% necessary, but it can be added to it. And you might want to hold it for about 30 seconds. I'm not a big fan on the amount of time you should hold a stretch. It's all about how often you do the stretch. So if you even only do it for 5 seconds every day, that's going to be better than 30 seconds a couple of times a week. So find, whenever you've got time, just get down and stretch the hip flexors. The other way of doing it, if you haven't got the opportunity to get down on the ground, you might be outdoors, but not in an appropriate place. So you put your back foot up onto a raised item, and then you can drop the knee down towards the ground until you feel that stretch. This is a lot harder because there's balance involved, and it will certainly get a bigger stretch. It might not be that comfortable in what you're doing on the ground, but it does really get a good stretch in that hip flex. And again, tilt that pelvis, don't let it tilt forward, tilt it underneath from there. So those two things alone will help release the hip flexors. The best thing to do for your hip flexors is not sit down for a long time during the day, but sometimes that's unavoidable, you just have to. So those two on a regular basis, as many times as you can throughout the day, will help switch those hip flexors off. When you release them, then we start trying to strengthen up the glute muscles to then combat the tightness of the hip flexors. The stronger our glutes, the less the hip flexors can really take over. The best one, the easiest one to do is whenever you find yourself standing still, just engage your glutes. You'll find your pelvis will tilt underneath you anyway, and you just engage your glutes. Relax, pelvis tilts. Engage, pelvis tilts back. And just practice that. That's a conscious thing you have to do. We want to get to a point where it's becomes subconscious, but at first you just have to keep thinking of just engaging those glutes and getting the pelvis to roll underneath. Another way of doing it is laying on the ground. Same thing, you want to tilt the pelvis back towards the floor. So you feel your lower back goes flat against the ground. And then what you're going to do, you're going to bring your heels as close to your backside as possible, because we don't want the hamstring to get too involved. And all you're going to do is tilt that pelvis and then lift up, squeezing your glutes, and then back down again. The further your feet are away from you, the more the hamstrings will get involved. And that's okay, but it will take the work away from your glutes. And we want to make sure the glutes are doing as much of the work as possible. So long as you get your heels as close to your backside as possible, tilt the pelvis, and then lift up. Engage those glutes. You don't want to hold it, you want to just come back down again. Tilt, lift up. The reason we don't want to hold it is when we walk around and we move throughout the day, our glutes don't stay switched on. They've got to switch on, switch off, switch on, switch off. So we're teaching the glutes to switch on, switch off, switch on, switch off. Now there's many other exercises you can do to help with this anterior tilt of your pelvis, but those two alone, those couple of stretches, these couple of exercises for your glutes will certainly get you on the right track to improving that imbalance. If you don't improve that imbalance, what will happen is your lower back will have to arch more to compensate for the pelvis tilting, and then you start getting some lower back discomfort and pain because the vertebrae are more compressed than they would be if the pelvis was level. But that's just a quick overview of how to improve that postural imbalance. But it's really down to how often you do it than actually the exercises that you are doing. So try to create yourself a routine, get into a habit of building consistency of these exercises, and you'll start seeing some relief if you are getting any back pain or pelvic pain.